It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 16. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we look at the headlines from Young Earth Creationist websites from the past week. This week we have Ark Encounter parking situation, Puffin origins, bird migration design, ancient archaeology, and I'm sure we'll touch on a few other topics as we go. I'm going to start this time by noting that the Young Earth Creationist community has lost a number of members in the past year. In this case, in the past month, a very, I can think, very significant member of the creation science community, Dr. David Menton. He was a good close colleague of Ken Ham's. As he notes here, Ken Ham tweeted about it, and he had an article on Facebook talking about David Menton. I've heard him speak. He really is a very good speaker. And he had worked after retirement for Answers in Genesis for more than 20 years. He only just retired maybe a month and a half ago. And then unfortunately contracted COVID and died of COVID. And so COVID has, touched the lives of people everywhere. And Answers in Genesis is no different in this particular case. But Dr. Menton is just one in a series of fairly uh, significant names in young Earth creationism that have passed on in the past couple of years. Things like John Whitmore. There's a number of names, and unless you're really familiar with young Earth creationism, you might not know. They're sort of behind the scenes, or people that did creation science research from the 60s and 70s, and so weren't very active. And that's why David Menton is fairly notable in terms of the effect that this has is that although he was retired, he was certainly very active even after retirement, right up until getting COVID. He's instrumental in designing some of the displays at the Creation Museum, including some that are just coming on board right now. He was still doing some talking, still doing a little bit of writing and so forth, and responded to various things that involved his field of expertise. And so this is a fairly big loss to the creation science community. Uh, I I bring this up partly because I've written a couple blog posts entitled "Where is the next generation of creation scientists?" And in there, I talk about and speculate about the future of young Earth creationism, and really, suggest there's a dire need, right, for young blood within the group. Right now, it still is a white male, white-haired club, right? And that club can't persist, for forever. And as we're seeing, many of those folks are passing away, and what they're leaving is that they're leaving a legacy of young Earth creationism, but is it being picked up by a younger generation? Ken Ham talks all the time about lost generation, about how people are leaving the church and so forth. I mean, he's essentially admitting that they're not maintaining and keeping, those who are in the church, and in his mind, those who are really in the church, are ones that believe in young Earth creationism, or hold to things that he would think should tend to lead you to young Earth creationism, and yet they're leaving in droves. And so superficially, there's a tremendous amount of success within young Earth creationism in the sense that they have a hold in terms of the social, um, culture wars sort of topics. But in terms of the creation science and convincing students to go into science and actually understand the world within this young Earth paradigm, they aren't terribly successful. Many students are fired up and want to go into this field. They go to school and they become disenchanted because they discover that a lot of young Earth creation science doesn't really work. When you get a broader view of the evidence and not just the limited view that you're given to their literature. A few of them survive, right? A few of them are diehard believers who aren't going to be swayed by anything. They've truly been convinced of that, and they proceed through that entire education, and they are becoming the next generation. But I don't think that they've replaced themselves with even the number that they had back in the 1970s, let's say the 1970s and 1980s. And so although the organizations have gotten larger, they've gotten larger based on sort of living off of the work of others that have come before them rather than generating significant new contributions. It's not to say that there aren't creation scientists that aren't working hard in that particular area, but it's a very small number. And you would think that if something is true, and God blesses that truth, that you would expect to see growth, and growth in terms of people really becoming convinced of this creation science stuff. And so you can understand, like back in the 1960s, all right, the world is against us. This is the truth. And as we continue to delve into it, as we continue to explore this, and we continue to bring the young Earth worldview to science and expand our understanding of how the world really is young, that it will begin to convince more and more people, because the truth will win out eventually. Now, of course, there's always going to be skeptics and those who are opposed to God, but at least within the church, it should certainly be a growing and overwhelming truth that becomes apparent, and that we throw off the previous paradigms of an ancient world that even maybe even Christians in the past believed in. That's not what has really happened. And so the question really is, where is the next generation of creation scientists that will bring that vision to fruition? Because it's on life support right now. I don't think it'll ever go away, contrary to what some might think. I think it's always going to hold a certain level of popularity, but I think they've reached their max popularity, and I think overall creation science isn't breaking new ground in terms of making any new convincing arguments that are changing anyone's minds at all. All right, but let's move on. Quickly, the Ark encounter. Here's an article from the local paper that's in the county where the Ark encounter is found in Grant County, Kentucky, telling the local residents that the Ark encounter plans some parking changes in the new year. So 2 years ago, the Ark encounter had announced that they would offer free parking to several counties in the vicinity of the Ark encounter, allowing people to come to, like, say, a lot of their events, right? So they have like a Christmas light thing right now. You can come park there for free. You can walk around the grounds and so forth. And there's actually a lot to see on the grounds, even without going into the Ark encounter itself, the building. And so and music events and so forth. And some of those would have had extra charges, but nonetheless, the parking was free. And now they're going to get rid of that. They're going to go back to $10 parking. I don't know if that includes a lot of things they market as free events to others. So I was there well, now I guess it's 2 months ago. And when I was there, I went for the Creation Expo. And there, when I went in, I wondered whether I was going to get charged for parking, and because it said it was a free event. And I said I was going into the Creation Expo. And when I said that, they said, okay, you can go on. So I didn't have to pay for parking. And I got in there, and then what happens is that when you go through the ticketing area, I had my free ticket already, and I showed it to them, and they gave me a wristband, and so I have a different colored wristband. That colored wristband tells them that I have access to the grounds, right? I have access to the expo center, which is where all their events take place, and I was able to go in there. But then the Ark encounter itself is separately gated, in a sense that you would then have to show the right kind of wristband in order to get into the Ark encounter. Well, as this article actually mentions, it's not hard to get in the Ark encounter if you're on the grounds, because you just go in the bookstore and go in the back side of it. There's really nothing to stop you from doing that. By the way, I did not do that. I looked at that and said, yeah, I could get in there, but I didn't pay for it, and that would be, to me, completely inappropriate to do. But as they point out, apparently this hasn't escaped the notice of maybe some local residents, because they're talking about how it actually costs money to have somebody sort of stand there and keep watch on everybody. Um, so yeah, I'm going to talk more about my whole experience at the Ark encounter in a separate video, which I've been promising for several weeks now, and I need to get to work on that. All right, let's stick with answers in Genesis and talk about the Puffin paradox. I thought this article came up a couple days ago by Heather Brinson Bruce, who is she has a college degree with degrees in English and chemistry, and now is a staff writer for Answers Magazine at Answers in Genesis. And so, this is just sort of your basic Answers Magazine is sort of their popular magazine, right? That just goes out to families and so forth that you would subscribe to. And so these pieces are light. I'm not expecting like heavy duty science in these articles, but nonetheless, I take a look at almost all of these just to see what kind of things. I guess what I think of it is the average young Earth creationist who's really into young Earth creation and is working for a ministry but doesn't have any expertise in like the science itself. And so where they get their information is they've read lots of creation science material. They've taken that knowledge then of what is creation science and everything I've been taught about it, and then they simply apply that to, hey, here's, what about puffins? Let's write a little interesting article about puffins, and what should I say about them? Well, I'll talk about some of their features, and then I put on the language of creation science on top of it. And I find that fascinating because it's kind of a way of looking at how the lens of how individuals who are, I guess, knowledgeable in creation science literature, but not experts in the sense that they've actually created any of that literature and sort of thought more deeply about it, and how they write to like the average person like themselves who might be at home reading this particular article. So it's an interesting perspective to sort of get a feel for creationism reading these articles. So anyway, this article, the Puffin paradox, and I guess the paradox wasn't really clear what the paradox was, right? But the paradox seems to be puffins are just these bumbling looking, super clowny, funny birds that have this awkward walk and they don't even fly very well, although they swim great. Um, by the way, that's a trade-off, right? If you can swim really well, then you can't have really great wings for flying in an adept way. So that's a characteristic trade-off that happens because you can't really be good at both at the same time because each of those characteristics requires specialized adaptations. And so if you're going to adapt to doing one thing really well, you generally lose the ability to do something else well. I mean, it's just kind of like our brains, right? We have parts of our brains that are really good at certain activities, and we devote a lot of our brain, right, processing power to that. And there's other things that we don't do as well, and we don't devote as much processing power to that. If I could see as well as an owl and I could smell as well as a dog and I could do all the different, if I could have the best um, characteristics of all the different animals out there, my brain would have to be twice as big as it is now to have enough processing power to do that. And so there's a trade-off in terms of just the total amount of brain power. And of course, humans have very large brains, but nonetheless, not nearly large enough in order to be able to like have exceptional eyesight, because I'd have to devote a large portion of my brain to my eyesight to do that. And that's exactly what animals that have good eyesight do, is that they're devoting their attention to eyesight versus something else. But I get myself distracted here again. Let's go into the article a little bit. There's just one thing I wanted that I want to draw out of this. But come a little closer to this farcical animal. But come a little closer to this farcical. You'll see a customized designs delivered by a conscientious creator. All right, so I mean, this is typical of these articles, right? God is the creator of all things. He has designed and made all things. Again, I don't object to that particular language. When he created the shorebird kind to which the puffins belong, right? So I'm going to emphasize my usual thing here. Here is an admission, all right, that puffins were not created as puffins by God in the beginning, right? So what's interesting about the article, and I find interesting about all these articles, it goes on to talk about all these incredible traits that they have, right? They have this great ability to swim, but they can still fly, and they have these different colorations, and the colors are to protect them in the water, but also protect them from the sky, from predators, and right, they have all these fantastic adaptations that make puffins exactly the way puffins are. But then you're saying here, puffins actually were created by God, but they actually weren't created as puffins by God. They were created as a shorebird by God. So God created shorebirds, And he created shorebirds in the beginning and somehow endowed them with all these different capacities to be able to adapt and become different kinds of shorebirds over time, allowing them to take on all these different characteristics through time. All right, so this is the idea of created heterozygosity way back at the beginning, and then somehow naturalistic explanations like natural selection and so forth adapt and shape these organisms into things they are. So I'm going to show you what some of those are. All right, so this is just a snapshot of a few of the major groups of shorebirds. So remember the statement before is that puffins, and puffins are auks, right up here. That's one of the auks, and there's been a lot of different auks through history. And puffins are a specialized adaptation of an auk itself, which is a very penguin-like looking thing, but don't think penguins because penguins are a completely different group of birds themselves, even though they have similar characteristics. But look at all these different traits, right? You've got your seagulls. There's 390 living shorebirds. There's probably at least that many or more extinct shorebirds. Shorebirds have a very long fossil history, and so there's many other different varieties of shorebirds that have existed. I'm particularly interested in these shorebirds right here, the plovers, because I watch killdeer and I've followed killdeer for many, many years. I know a lot about their behaviors. But when I think about the shorebirds, I think about, okay, they have some similar traits, but they live in forest. Some live in deserts, right? Some live inland their entire lives. Yes, many live along the shore. Some are specialized for their waders. Actually, you have waders here. You have the ones that are, skimming along the edge of the shoreline, right? You have seagulls, which are then getting fish. You have others that dive into the water and swim in the water. You have others that, like I said, live inland and don't really deal with the water at all. They've adapted to other locations, right? That's an incredible amount of diversity within the shorebirds. Um, and yet, this very quick throwaway line in this article is just showing that, hey, this is what Answers in Genesis and others in creationism are promoting now, that God just created something, some critter that then had the ability to become all these very different organisms. To any evolutionary biologist, they would say, oh yeah, you're looking at tens of millions of years of evolution having happened here, which creationists say happened in just a few hundred years. And that's just a very radical proposal that I think creationists are still trying to get a grasp on in terms of trying to explain how this could possibly happen. But they just sort of have made it so trivial sounding, as if like, well, God designed this shorebird, and then voila, after the flood, all these shorebirds suddenly exist and have all been derived one from another. Speaking as a biologist, these are really very different organisms with very different genomes and different genes, right, and different ways of operating. To say that any one of them gave rise to another is to say that organisms can change from one kind to another. Oh yeah, here's some of the auks as well. That's just the auks, and in the auks, then you have the puffins, of which there are several different types of puffins, and there's a fossil record of puffins showing that puffins have existed over large parts of the world and have become extinct very long ago. So not only do they have to have evolved after Noah's flood from some other shorebird, but then they had to evolve and live in communities and then go extinct well before man ever arrived in those different locations. An incredible amount of genetic diversity and action happening in a very short period of time, according to this young Earth creationist model. Let's stick with birds for a moment, but now we're going to go to Institute for Creation Research and an article by James Johnson. So Christ's providence is clearly seen in bird migrations. Right, and this is a very similar article in the sense that bird migrations are so incredibly complex, and I can't imagine any way, at least for this author, I can't imagine any way that they have adapted and evolved over time from an ancestor that wasn't able to migrate. So therefore, a creator had to have made this particular features. As he says here, because the challenging mix of birds' metabolic needs for long distance travel, synchronized seasonal and diurnal weather conditions are exacerbated by unyielding entropy. This is an all or nothing complexity prohibits lucky bird migrations. In short, seasonally migrated birds need the Lord Jesus Christ providential bioengineering care. Migration, again, it's an irreducibly complex thing is the argument here. It's so complex, it couldn't have evolved from simpler parts or birds that didn't migrate and therefore had to somehow learn to migrate, which sounds like learning and getting new information and changing in such a dramatic way that that would go beyond what young Earth creationists are willing to accept. However, I think if you go back to my previous example of the shorebirds, I would say when I look at killdeer and I see what they can do, they clearly have adapted and changed and derived new traits that weren't in their ancestors. That's really no different. They should be calling killdeer separate kinds from puffins, all right, which are fantastic swimmers in the ocean, whereas killdeer don't swim in the ocean. They live out here in Ohio, right? Laying their eggs on in gravel. Very different behaviors and very different strategies for living in this world. Okay, but back to migrations. So let me just highlight here here's the highlights from the article. Migratory flight is a biographical life or death challenge. The biophysics of bird flights require more than the luck to succession. So great precision is required. This is another common strategy, young earth creation, right? This is so precise. What could make this precise? Certainly nothing random could make that precise, right? That contrasting of it has to be a designer because randomness can't make precision. Avian migration successes display God's bioengineering handiwork that was programmed in these birds from the beginning. Now, here's where I think I just want to stop and think about this for a moment because I've always found the migration thing fascinating from a young Earth creationist perspective. All right, so often this article and other articles that I read note the amazing migration ability of particular birds that live, like say on a Arctic island, and then they're flying south like 1,000 miles to some other location in the the winter time. And they'll say like, that's just how could they're like programmed to know exactly where to go. Their flight patterns, they have to have a certain amount of energy that they've gained because they had a little bit less energy, they wouldn't make it. And if they don't make it, of course, they're not going to be able to reproduce. So all of that is just so complex. It couldn't have occurred by natural selection and any other adaptive evolutionary mechanisms, right? None of those things could have actually made a bird be able to do this migration pattern. But then, it kind of makes me scratch my head though. I'm like, but those birds, if they were created by God, all right, on, in the 6 days of creation and 6,000 years ago, and then they lived in a world which young Earth creationists are telling us looked totally different than the world today, right? All the islands that exist out there in the ocean didn't exist. Like the Hawaiian Islands and places like that, because they're volcanoes. Those occurred later on. They weren't part of the creation. And the continents weren't even in the same organization they are now. In fact, some creationists would say maybe all the continents were actually together in one large continental piece before the fall, before the flood caused their breakup and then spreading out over the world. So if all the land was together at one time, the original created birds they would have migrated, but they would have been migrating across land and not nearly as far as they do now. And then you would have had this dramatic, catastrophic event where the world now the continents are separated, and now birds are now traveling across continents and even across large water bodies between continents. And then there are these islands that are formed, and so what are we being told here? Are we being told that God programmed birds with the coordinates for future islands that were going to suddenly come to exist 2,000 years from now? And so after these birds got off the ark, Well, let's take, for example, the shorebirds we just talked about. Some, but not all, of the shorebirds do migrations. Many migrate maybe short distances. Some migrate very long distances. Actually, the killdeer that I watch, the individual pairs of killdeer that I watch, they disappear in the wintertime and they fly south at least to Florida and possibly into Central America. And next year they'll come back and make a nest at the exact same location. I'll see the same two birds that were there a year before, right? So they make this amazing journey. But not all the shorebirds do that. But okay, now, stick with me here. So these birds, they didn't exist as killdeer, right? Or puffins in the creation, according to the previous article you just saw, right? They were just some kind of basic shorebird. Maybe that shorebird, and would that shorebird have needed to migrate? Because many creationists believe that there's one continent, as I said before, but I didn't say before that that one continent might have had kind of like fairly even weather pattern, right? There wasn't any drastic like super desert, super high elevation mountains, because there weren't many mountains before the flood. And then there weren't far northern climates, so there wasn't snow. And so the animals are kind of like, hey, things are pretty good. Now, why do animals migrate? They migrate because the changes in global weather patterns over the year is their primary reason of migrating. So if birds didn't even need to migrate in the original creation, but God had somehow instilled in them this very specific ability to migrate and for particular species to migrate with these very fine-tuned abilities to go, like for one particular bird, like you can go from here and you can fly this little tiny bird and you can fly 1,000 miles over water, right? And you have to know exactly how much food to put away. You have to be you have a certain fat density and so forth before you can take off. And you have to know that, right? You have to kind of like be programmed to know that. And then you take off and you fly there and you survive. Um, but each different species has its own requirements, right? Each species is migrating to different places that have very different requirements for them to actually make that trip. How is all that information stored in the original bird? That's just mind-boggling, right? It's just, it doesn't compute from a biological perspective for sure. And it's just fascinating from a like pre-program point of view. Like God's creating creatures that don't need to have any of these features, and yet He's somehow putting into their genomes all these features that they're not even going to use for 1,500 years. And to remember, during that time, they're speciating during the 1,500 years between the creation and the flood. And as they speciate, if they don't need to migrate, what about genetic entropy? Isn't that destroying all the genes and the information that for them to be able to do this migration? And then somehow right after the flood, they get off the ark, just two of them, two shorebirds, right? Just two shorebirds get off the ark. They lay some eggs, and out of that comes 10 shorebirds. And those 10 shorebirds have variation, and somehow those birds fly off to different places in the world. And then some of them suddenly know how to migrate 2,000 miles, and this other one just stays where it is, and this other one migrates from these different places, but it's not, only 100 miles. Where does all that come from? And I guess that's why the emphasis here on bioengineering. Like Christ, God's the most amazing bioengineer. He's engineered all that into this little package of a shorebird. And then he plans for it to survive. All this engineering survives for 1,500 years. He has to select two individuals to be on the ark that still contain all the information, and then allow them to then explore all that variation to become perfectly adapted, each species, to exactly the migratory patterns that they have today. That's kind of a stretch. If it is same as all, I mean, if what Johnson does, which I know he does in many of his articles, it's sort of like, well, I mean, evolution couldn't do this. Natural mechanisms couldn't do this at all because it's too complex and it's too amazing, and I can't believe it. This is asking for as much or more. belief, you know, in terms of a theory. Uh, Anyway, so much could be said about migrating birds. Maybe someday I'll pick up an article and we'll look at like the science of migration, and we'll look at people who have actually studied migratory patterns and actually studied how migratory patterns change. And there's a whole deep literature on natural selection and adaptation and how migratory habits evolve over time, change and evolve over time. And remember, young Earth creationists actually do believe that migratory patterns evolve because, as I just pointed out, some of these birds, right, they came from just two birds on the ark and they've turned into 50 different birds that have 50 different migratory patterns and they do their migrations in different ways. And therefore, they have changed and adapted to their environments in very very different fashions. I just saw this article on creation.com. How old are the, I can't pronounce it, Gobekli Tepe and the lost century of Dwarka, which is in, I believe that's in India. And, this was a question from a reader. So they take responses from readers that get sent in and they sift through them and find something they find interesting, and they're like, we'll respond to this. And so they wrote an article responding to, hey, these are two places that are thought to be two of the oldest civilizations of or cities built by man. I think Dwarka is like 7 to 9 thousand years old or something like that, and the one in Turkey, Tepe, is at least 7,000 years old. Now, of course, young Earth creationists think that no city can be older than 4,500 years old because that's the time of the flood. So, and the flood would have destroyed any city from pre-flood times. So, any evidence, archaeological evidence that's more than 4,500 years old is obviously a threat to the young Earth chronology. And so they get questions, obviously they get questions from readers all the time because they read in National Geographic or something like that about this city that was built in 6,500, BC or something like that. That's too long ago for the young Earth creationists. So how do they explain it? Well, this is just the typical stuff. All right, you can't trust carbon-14 dating. The older you can trust it for the last 1,000 years because obviously we have objects that are 700 years old that we know are 700 years old, and the carbon-14 dating is pretty close to 700 years old. So it seems like it works as an actual, like the science of it works, like the measurement and the calculation. But then they'll say that as you go farther back in time, it becomes more sketchy. And so they're basically just sort of casting doubt on the idea that the carbon-14 dates for these sites could be right. They don't actually come up with a positive argument for showing they're young. They simply say that they're not as old as they seem to be in different kinds of dating mechanisms. And so they kind of take each of the different kinds of things that have been used to date these sites and then cast aspersions upon them and simply leave the reader with, well, it may not be that old because of X, Y, and Z. Therefore, it's okay to believe that they're younger. But we're not actually going to give you the date, right? They don't actually discuss like when they would have been built, other than they had to have been built after Babel, which is only about 4,000 years ago. And so they must be far, far younger than they actually look. And I can't believe that that would be a very satisfying answer to many of their readers, but it's really the only answer they have. The answer is kind of, they have to be younger because of this. All right, I think that sums it up. That wraps it up for this week. This week in creationism. There's a lot of other stuff that's being discussed on creation websites over the past week or two. There's a lot of seasonal type articles, so things about Christmas, a lot of sort of cultural topics, not so much science stuff, and so I'm kind of focusing on the science things on this week in creationism. So that's it for this week. I'll probably be back maybe before the new year or right after the new year, and we'll kind of discuss where's young Earth creationism going in 2022. Hope to see you then. Thanks a lot. Have a great Christmas and a new year. Bye bye.